August 1945. The sky above Oregon glowed an unnatural orange, the kind of light that meant the forests were dying. Smoke rose in pillars so thick they blotted out the sun. From a command tent miles away, a white officer squinted through binoculars, watching specks of black drop from the sky. "Those are the Negro paratroopers," someone muttered behind him. "The army really sent them for this?" A chuckle rippled through the tent. "First time they'll hit the ground before running from it." They laughed, until they realized the men weren't retreating. They were running toward the fire. Within minutes, flames swallowed the ridge. The roar was deafening, the heat like a living creature. The soldiers on the ground were ghosts in gray smoke, axes in their hands instead of rifles, faces streaked with soot and sweat. They were the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the Army's first all-black airborne unit, trained for war, but sent to fight something no one had ever faced before. The officer lowered his binoculars, the laughter dying in his throat. The black paratroopers had just become America's last line of defense. They called them the Triple Nickels, 3 5s, a symbol that meant nothing to most Americans, but everything to the men who wore it. Officially, they were the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the first all-black airborne unit in United States history. Formed in 1943 at the height of World War II, they trained at Fort Benning, Georgia, the same base that turned out America's finest paratroopers. But while white recruits prepared for Europe, the black soldiers trained in isolation, separate barracks, separate dining halls, separate futures. The Army brass said it wasn't racism, it was policy. Black troops, they claimed, lacked the discipline and courage for airborne operations. So they were tested harder, drilled longer, and equipped worse. Their parachutes were second-hand, their boots were hand-me-downs. Every jump was a test, not just of gravity, but of dignity. When they trained, white instructors watched with skepticism. One officer reportedly muttered, "They won't even jump once." But they did, again and again, until they had more jumps logged than the very men sent to evaluate them. They weren't just learning how to fall. They were learning how to rise, in a country determined to hold them down. One veteran later recalled, "We had to be twice as good to be considered half as brave, so we were." By 1945, the Triple Nickels were combat-ready, elite, and eager for deployment overseas. They waited for orders to Europe or the Pacific, but those orders never came. Instead, a sealed envelope arrived at headquarters with new instructions and a mission that would change everything. The orders stunned the men. No overseas deployment, no Europe, no Pacific. Instead, 3 words stamped in red ink. Operation Firefly, confidential. Their new enemy wasn't human, it was the sky itself. In the winter of 1944, Japanese forces had launched nearly 9,000 balloon bombs across the Pacific Ocean, ingenious hydrogen spheres carrying incendiary charges designed to ignite America's forests and farms. Most never reached land, but a few did. Each one that did was a potential catastrophe. By 1945, the U.S. Army feared a chain of fires could sweep the Pacific Northwest, threatening cities, rail lines, even ammunition depots. They needed troops who could deploy anywhere, within hours, to drop straight into infernos that ground crews couldn't reach. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the Triple Nickels, was reassigned to the U.S. Forest Service for a mission no soldier had trained for before: fire jumping. Parachuting into wildfires, armed not with rifles but with axes, shovels, and courage. Officially, the mission didn't exist. Unofficially, it made them America's first smoke jumpers. They trained in Oregon's rough backcountry, learning to leap into smoke columns, steer through burning air, and land among trees whose crowns were already aflame. Their parachutes scorched mid-descent, boots melted on impact. They swapped ammunition pouches for water canteens, grenades for coils of rope. "At first," one of them said later, "we thought it was punishment. Then we realized it was trust disguised as doubt." The white officers who had laughed at their assignment called it a public relations project. The men of the Triple Nickels knew better. Every jump was a battle, every landing zone, an ambush of wind and fire. The war was ending overseas, but for these soldiers, the fight was just beginning. The enemy was invisible, unpredictable, and everywhere the wind could carry a spark. Their first call came in May 1945. Lightning storms had ignited the mountains of Oregon and Washington. Dozens of blazes were spreading through old-growth forest, carried by winds strong enough to lift embers miles ahead of the flames. Ground crews couldn't reach the ridges. Someone in command muttered, "Send the colored paratroopers, see if they can handle the heat." The next morning, 30 men boarded a C-47 transport. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of fuel, canvas, and sweat. They wore helmets lined with asbestos, heavy jumpsuits over long sleeves, armor against fire but not against fear. 5 minutes! The jumpmaster shouted. Outside, smoke billowed like storm clouds. The horizon looked alive. Below them, an ocean of green turned black at the edges, trees twisting in waves of fire. Private Malvin Brown, a 20-year-old from Ohio, tightened his straps. He had dreamed of fighting in Europe, of dropping behind enemy lines in France. Instead, he was about to leap into a burning forest in his own country. The light turned green. They jumped. Heat rose to meet them halfway down, a blast furnace that clawed at their faces. Parachutes snapped open with a crack like gunfire. Visibility, 0. Smoke so thick you could taste it. Some landed hard in clearings. Others crashed through treetops, tangled in branches 50 feet above the ground. Brown wasn't so lucky. His chute caught fire before he hit the forest floor. He burned alive alone somewhere in the Cascades. The army listed it as a training accident. The survivors cut themselves free and ran toward the flames. No medals, no headlines, just the sound of fire and their own breath. For 24 hours, they dug lines, cut trenches, smothered hotspots. No one told them how to fight a wildfire. They learned by surviving it. When the last ember died, they collapsed on blackened ground. Boots melted, skin blistered, lungs raw from smoke. A white officer arrived by jeep, surveying the wreckage. "They made it out?" he asked, surprised. "Yes, sir," came the reply. "Every one but Brown." He said nothing more. The laughter that had greeted their orders was gone. Only the smoke remained. In the months that followed, the triple nickels became ghosts of the western skies. Wherever smoke rose, they appeared, silent, swift, unrecorded. From May through October 1945, they leapt into more than 1,200 fires, scattered across 6 states and millions of acres of forest. Each jump began the same way, a low-flying C-47, the drone of engines over mountains, a red light turning green. They stepped into heat so fierce it curled their parachutes. Some landed on ridgelines that disintegrated beneath them, others in burning clearings where the ground itself breathed flame. Axes replaced rifles, shovels became bayonets against the fire's advance. Every breath tasted of ash and pine resin. There were no reporters waiting at the airstrips when they returned. Their missions were classified, to prevent public panic. Even the word firefighter was forbidden in Army communique. Officially, the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion was still training. Unofficially, it was fighting an undeclared war against a nation's own wilderness. In towns near their bases, uniformed Germans from POW camps sat freely in diners that refused to serve the black paratroopers who had just saved those towns from burning. The contradiction burned hotter than the fires. "They told us we weren't real soldiers," one veteran said years later. "So we fought fires the way soldiers fight wars, one hill at a time." The work never stopped. They jumped by day, slept beside smoldering logs by night, then boarded planes again at dawn. Boots melted, lungs filled with soot, knees shattered on rocky landings. Medical supplies ran thin, replacements never came, but morale held, built on pride no one could take away. By summer's end, they had contained dozens of major blazes, saved entire logging towns, and protected critical war industries along the West Coast. Still, there were no commendations, no press releases, no recognition. The army moved on. Europe celebrated victory. Japan's surrender loomed. For the triple nickels, there was only another alarm, another smoke column on the horizon. When the final jump season ended, they packed their gear in silence. Some believed their service would change minds, that bravery might erase color. But the news never came. History didn't record their names, their missions, or their dead. They had risked their lives for a nation that refused to look their way. Yet among themselves, they carried proof stronger than any medal. "We saw the fire," a trooper said softly, "and we went anyway." August 1945. The war overseas was ending, but on the American West Coast, the sky itself was at war. A cluster of lightning strikes, and some whispered a Japanese balloon bomb, ignited 3 separate infernos in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. Winds from the Pacific merged them into a single monster, a wall of flame 20 miles wide, leaping from ridge to ridge. Locals would remember it as the Hell's Ridge Fire. At Fort Bragg, a white commander looked at the maps and frowned. "Send in the triple Nichols," he said. His aide hesitated. "Sir, the wind's too strong. We'll lose men." The commander exhaled. "If they can't hold the line, we lose half the coast." The next morning, 60 men climbed aboard 2 transport planes. No press, no fanfare, just orders and smoke on the horizon. They flew low over a landscape already glowing red beneath them. "Jump!" came the signal. They dropped through clouds of burning cinders. The air howled past their helmets. Heat clawed upward in waves. Parachutes opened barely 200 feet above treetops. One man hit a branch and fell 30 feet into flame. Another landed running, straight into a wall of smoke so thick it erased the world. They worked in teams, cutting fire breaks, beating the blaze back with shovels and their bare hands. By nightfall, the flames surrounded them on 3 sides. Evacuation was impossible. They dug trenches into the earth, laid flat, and prayed the wind would turn. It didn't. Through the night, they fought the fire inch by inch, collapsing from exhaustion, rising again. Ammunition wouldn't have helped them. Courage was the only weapon left. By dawn, the wind shifted. When the sun broke over Hell's Ridge, the fire had stopped. Behind them lay a blackened scar that stretched for miles. Below, the towns still stood, untouched. The triple Nichols had held the line. When the smoke cleared, an army truck arrived to retrieve the survivors. The driver stepped down, looked around at the destruction, and muttered, "My God, they saved everything." No medals were awarded, no reporters came, but for those who were there, it was clear. The Army's most doubted men had become America's last defense, against the fire and against the lie that they couldn't fight. Days after the Hell's Ridge fire was contained, Japan surrendered. America celebrated victory. Crowds in Times Square, parades, fireworks lighting skies the triple Nichols had once watched burn for real. But for the men who'd fought the flames, there were no crowds waiting, no bands, no medals. Their orders arrived without ceremony. Return to base. Mission concluded. No one mentioned their dead. Malvin Brown's name never appeared on casualty lists. His family received a letter that said only, "Your son died in service to his country." Within weeks, the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion was quietly disbanded. The files marked Operation Firefly were sealed and classified to prevent public alarm. Officially, the battalion had spent the summer of 1945 in training maneuvers. The truth lay buried under smoke and bureaucracy. When the men returned home, the war's contradictions followed them. At rail stations in Georgia and Texas, they stepped off trains wearing jump wings and service ribbons, only to be told to use the colored waiting room. Some were denied GI Bill benefits. Others couldn't find work because their records listed no combat action. They had risked their lives to defend a coast that didn't want to claim them. The laughter that had once mocked them was gone, replaced by silence. A silence deeper and colder than the smoke-choked air they had breathed all summer. "We saved towns that never learned our names," one veteran said years later. "We came home heroes nowhere but in our own hearts." Time moved on. The forests regrew. The headlines forgot. Only the men remembered. The sound of wind in the open door, the orange glow below, the weight of a nation on their shoulders. Their story faded. Like the last embers of a fire no one had cared to see. Half a century later, someone opened a file that was never meant to be read. Inside were reports stamped Operation Firefly Classified, flight logs, casualty lists, weather maps marked with circles of red, and at the top of every page, 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion. The discovery reignited a story the nation had forgotten. Historians traced the names, interviewed survivors now in their 70s and 80s, men who had raised families, built lives, and rarely spoken of what they had done. When asked why, one smiled and said, "We figured history had better things to do than remember us." But history remembered. In 1995, the U.S. Forest Service and the Department of Defense held a ceremony in Pendleton, Oregon, the very airfield where the triple Nichols had once boarded burning skies. A new monument bore 60 names, men who had jumped into fire so others didn't have to. Parachutes hung behind glass. A bronze plaque read, "They fought fire with courage and prejudice with grace." Survivors stood in the front row, uniforms snug across aging shoulders. Reporters asked what the honor meant after so many years. One veteran answered softly, "We didn't jump for medals. We jumped because the job needed doing. Fire doesn't care what color you are." The crowd fell silent. For the first time, that silence wasn't neglect, it was respect. Today, the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion is recognized as the first black airborne unit and pioneers of modern smoke jumping. Their motto lives on in training halls and memorials across the country, "Through the fire." After 50 years in the shadows, their story finally had light. They said black soldiers couldn't lead. They said they couldn't fight, couldn't fly, couldn't fall from the sky and rise again. But when America's forests burned, when the wind carried fire instead of bullets, it was the black paratroopers who jumped. No medals waited, no headlines followed. Only the silence of the woods after the flames had died, and the knowledge that they had done what others would not. The triple Nichols fought not for glory, but for proof that courage is colorblind, that patriotism isn't granted by a nation, but proven by sacrifice. Their bodies bore the burns, their lungs the smoke, and their names the weight of history's delay. But they never stopped jumping, into danger, into duty, into dignity. "They laughed at us," one veteran said, "but they don't laugh anymore." The laughter had burned away, consumed by the same flames those men had faced head-on. And when the fire was gone, what remained was not the smoke, but their legacy, etched into the sky they once fell through. The black paratroopers had become what history denied them to be, America's last line of defense.